Once the leather was soft, they used needles made of bird bones and thread made of animal tendons to sew everything into warm, fitted tunics. Right now, somewhere in your own cells, there's a piece of a story you were never told in school. A small fraction of your genetic code, sitting quietly inside almost every person of non-African descent, did not come from your direct ancestors. It came from another kind of human, a different species, one that walked this planet at the same time as us, hunted in the same forests, warmed itself by the same fires, and then, over the course of a few thousand years, simply stopped existing. We are taught to think of humanity as a single, unbroken line stretching back into the mists of prehistory, one species slowly becoming smarter, standing a little more upright with every generation, until it became us. That story is comforting. It is also wrong. For most of the time that anything resembling a human has existed on Earth, there has never been just one kind of human. There have almost always been several, sometimes many, sharing the same continents, competing for the same resources, occasionally meeting face to face in the same valleys and caves. We are the outlier. We are the first and only human species in hundreds of thousands of years to have the entire planet to ourselves, and that fact alone should make us deeply curious about what happened to everyone else. To understand what happened, we have to go back roughly 2 million years to a world where the genus Homo had already begun branching out like a tree with many limbs. Homo erectus, tall, long-legged, and remarkably successful, had already spread out of Africa and into Asia long before our own species even existed. Its descendants and cousins would eventually diversify into a whole caste of different human species, each adapted to a different environment, each carrying a different combination of strength, intelligence, and vulnerability. By the time modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa somewhere around 300,000 years ago, we were not stepping into an empty world. We were stepping into a planet that was already crowded with our own relatives. In Europe and Western Asia, the dominant human species was the Neanderthal. For a long time, popular culture painted them as little more than brutish cavemen, hunched over, low-browed, grunting their way through a violent existence. That picture has been almost completely dismantled by modern archaeology. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than our own. They controlled fire with confidence, cooked their food, treated injuries, and in some cases survived for years after suffering wounds that would have killed them without care from others in their group. They buried their dead, sometimes with objects placed carefully beside the body, a practice that hints at some form of ritual or belief about what happens after death. In caves in Spain, researchers have found evidence that Neanderthals created geometric patterns and used pigments in ways that closely resemble art. They were not a failed draft of humanity. They were a fully realized version of it, shaped by tens of thousands of years of adaptation to cold European winters and the demands of hunting large, dangerous animals at close range. Farther east, in the mountains of Siberia, lived a group of humans we know almost entirely through fragments. In a cave called Denisova, scientists discovered a tiny piece of a finger bone belonging to a young girl, along with a few teeth. From that scrap of bone, geneticists managed to reconstruct an entire genome and discovered something remarkable. This was not a Neanderthal, and it was not a modern human. It was something else entirely, a previously unknown branch of the human family tree that we now call the Denisovans. We still do not know exactly what they looked like, because so little physical evidence has survived. What we do know is that they were widespread, that they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans, and that some populations living today, particularly in parts of the Pacific and the Tibetan Plateau, carry Denisovan genes that appear to have helped their ancestors survive in extreme environments, from high altitude to the tropics. And then there is perhaps the strangest chapter in this story, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores. There, researchers uncovered the remains of a human species barely a meter tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, yet one that made stone tools and apparently hunted animals many times its own size. Nicknamed the hobbits after the fictional creatures, Homo floresiensis appears to have survived in isolation on that island until surprisingly recently in evolutionary terms, perhaps overlapping in time with early modern humans passing through the region. Similar surprises have emerged elsewhere. In the Philippines, remains of another small-bodied human species, Homo luzonensis, have been found. In a cave system in South Africa, a species called Homo naledi, with a strange mixture of primitive and advanced physical traits, was found buried deep underground in a way that some researchers believe suggests deliberate disposal of the dead, an idea that continues to spark intense debate. So the world our ancestors were born into was not a lonely one. It was a world shared by several distinct human species, each with its own tools, its own social structures, and in at least some cases, its own forms of symbolic thought. What makes our species different is not that we were smarter in some simple, obvious way. Many of these other humans had comparable or even larger brains. What made us different, and what may ultimately explain why we are the only ones left, becomes clear once we look at what happened when these different kinds of humans began to encounter one another. Roughly 70,000 years ago, give or take, groups of modern humans began moving out of Africa in larger and more sustained waves than any that had come before. As they spread across the Arabian Peninsula and into Europe and Asia, they inevitably ran into populations of Neanderthals and Denisovans who had already been living in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years. This moment, the meeting of different human species on the same landscape, is one of the most debated events in the entire history of paleoanthropology, because the evidence points in more than one direction at once, and reconciling those directions has taken decades of careful, sometimes contentious research. One line of evidence points toward violence. At certain Neanderthal burial and occupation sites, researchers have found skeletal remains bearing injuries that closely resemble wounds inflicted by weapons associated with modern human toolkits, rather than the kinds of injuries typically caused by animal attacks or accidents. Some sites show signs of sudden catastrophic events, entire groups seemingly wiped out at once. Taken alone, this kind of evidence has led some scientists to argue that the disappearance of Neanderthals and other archaic humans was, at least in part, the result of direct conflict, perhaps not a single dramatic war, but a long, grinding pattern of skirmishes and raids as different groups competed over hunting grounds, caves, and other limited resources. In a world where population densities were already low and resources were often scarce, even relatively small scale, sporadic violence could have had an outsized effect on already vulnerable populations. But another, equally powerful line of evidence tells a very different story, one of intimacy rather than only conflict. When scientists finally sequenced the full Neanderthal genome in the early 21st century, they made a discovery that reshaped our understanding of human history almost overnight. Buried within the DNA of modern humans outside of Africa was a small but unmistakable signature of Neanderthal ancestry, typically between 1 and 2% of the genome. This was not the result of a single chance encounter. The pattern of shared genetic material indicates that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred repeatedly in multiple locations over an extended period of time, Later research revealed a similar story with the Denisovans, whose genetic legacy shows up prominently in the DNA of people from Melanesia, parts of Southeast Asia, and other regions of Asia. In other words, the boundary between our species and these other humans was not a hard wall. It was porous. People from these different populations lived close enough and interacted closely enough to have children together, and those children and their descendants are part of the reason billions of people alive today carry fragments of a species that no longer technically exists. So which is it? Did modern humans wipe out their cousins through violence, or did they simply absorb them through generations of intermixing? The honest answer, based on the accumulated evidence, is that both processes were almost certainly happening at the same time, in different places, at different moments, depending on local circumstances. In some regions, contact may have been largely peaceful, leading to intermarriage and gradual genetic blending. In other regions, especially where resources were scarce or competition was intense, contact may have escalated into violence. But there is a third factor, quieter and less dramatic than either war or romance, that many researchers now consider to be the single most important driver of what ultimately happened. And it has less to do with any single violent event, and more to do with simple demographic math. Homo sapiens appears to have maintained substantially larger, more interconnected populations than Neanderthals or Denisovans ever did. Genetic studies suggest that Neanderthal populations, in particular, were small and fragmented, likely numbering only in the tens of thousands across their entire range at any given time, with limited genetic diversity that hints at long-term isolation between different groups. Modern humans, by contrast, appear to have maintained larger social networks that stretched across greater distances, exchanging not just genes, but also ideas, tools, and technologies between groups that might be separated by hundreds of kilometers. This difference in social scale may have translated into a decisive practical advantage. Larger, more connected populations recover more easily from bad years, droughts, disease outbreaks, or local disasters. They can share innovations more quickly. They can specialize more effectively, dividing labor and knowledge across a wider group of people. A small, isolated population of highly skilled, physically robust Neanderthals might have been able to outcompete an equally sized group of modern humans in a single valley over a single generation. But across thousands of years and vast landscapes, the sheer scale and connectivity of modern human populations may have made the eventual outcome almost inevitable, not through dramatic battles, but through a slow, grinding process of demographic replacement, as modern human groups gradually expanded into territory, absorbing or displacing smaller neighboring populations one region at a time. Climate change likely played a significant supporting role in this story as well. The period during which Neanderthals disappeared, roughly 40,000 years ago, coincided with a series of dramatic and rapid climate fluctuations across Europe, sudden shifts between warmer and colder conditions that would have placed enormous stress on any population trying to survive by hunting large, cold, adapted animals across an unstable landscape. A species already living in small, scattered groups with limited genetic diversity would have been far less resilient to this kind of environmental chaos than a more numerous, more widely distributed population capable of shifting its territory or its strategies in response to changing conditions. In this sense, modern humans may not have needed to defeat Neanderthals in any direct confrontation at all. They may simply have been better equipped, demographically and socially, to weather a period of environmental instability that Neanderthal populations, already stretched thin, could not survive. There is also a case to be made for a subtler kind of advantage, one rooted not in muscle or population size, but in the structure of thought and communication itself. Some researchers argue that modern humans developed a particular capacity for cumulative culture, the ability to build on the ideas of previous generations in increasingly complex ways, passing down not just practical skills, but abstract concepts, stories, and symbolic systems that could bind large groups of unrelated people together around shared beliefs and identities. Evidence for this kind of symbolic behavior appears in the archaeological record earlier and more consistently among modern humans than among Neanderthals, though the gap has narrowed considerably as more Neanderthal art and ornamentation has been discovered in recent years. If modern humans really did possess a distinct edge in their capacity for large-scale cooperation, complex language, and cultural transmission, it would help explain how relatively physically weaker groups of humans could, over enough time, outcompete stronger, more locally adapted populations across an entire continent. What makes this story more than a simple tale of one species defeating another is what happened afterward. Or rather, what did not fully happen. Neanderthals and Denisovans did not vanish without a trace. They persisted, quietly, inside us. The genetic material that modern humans inherited from these other species was not evenly scattered or randomly distributed across our genome. Certain regions of Neanderthal DNA appear far more frequently in modern populations than others, particularly genes associated with skin and hair characteristics that may have helped early modern humans adapt more quickly to the lower sunlight conditions of northern latitudes, essentially borrowing millennia of Neanderthal adaptation to European winters in a single generation through interbreeding. Other inherited genes are linked to immune system function, offering modern humans some resistance to pathogens that Neanderthals had already been dealing with for tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived in their territory. In this sense, the genetic legacy of these vanished species may have given modern human populations a crucial survival advantage, precisely in the regions where those other species had lived the longest. At the same time, other portions of the genome show what scientists call Neanderthal deserts, long stretches of modern human DNA that are conspicuously free of any Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting that certain genetic combinations inherited from Neanderthals may have been mildly harmful or reduced fertility in hybrid individuals, and were therefore gradually filtered out by natural selection over thousands of generations. Some studies have linked certain surviving fragments of Neanderthal DNA to increased risk of particular health conditions in modern humans, including some immune disorders and altered pain sensitivity, a strange and very literal example of how an extinction event tens of thousands of years in the past can still shape the day-to-day experience of people living today, most of whom have no idea that any part of this history lives inside their own bodies. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis, the diminutive hobbit species of Flores, followed a somewhat different pattern, one shaped more by island isolation than by direct competition with modern humans across a continent. Living in a confined island environment for potentially hundreds of thousands of years, this population had evolved a distinctive combination of traits, likely as an adaptation to limited food resources, a phenomenon sometimes called island dwarfism, that has been observed in various animal species isolated on islands throughout history. When modern humans eventually arrived in the region, whether through direct conflict, competition for limited island resources, disease transmission, or simply the disruption of established ecological patterns, the already fragile population of Homo floresiensis appears to have disappeared relatively quickly. The exact mechanism remains a subject of ongoing research and debate, but the broader pattern echoes the story we see elsewhere. a smaller, more isolated human population meeting a more widespread, more adaptable one, and not surviving the encounter for very long afterward. Taken together, all of this evidence points toward an uncomfortable but important reframing of how we should think about human evolution. We often imagine evolution as a straightforward story of improvement, one species giving way to a better adapted successor in a clean, almost mechanical progression. The reality of what happened to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the other archaic human species that once shared this planet with us is messier, more human, in the fullest and most complicated sense of that word. It involves violence in some places and intimacy in others. It involves demographic luck as much as biological superiority. It involves climate, chance, and the slow accumulation of small advantages across thousands of years rather than any single decisive victory. And it involves an ending that was not really an ending at all, since the genetic and perhaps even cultural legacy of these other human species continues to live on, diffused and diluted, inside nearly every person currently reading or listening to this account of their own deep history. There is one more dimension to this story worth sitting with, because it says as much about the present as it does about the deep past. For the overwhelming majority of the time that anything resembling a human being has existed on Earth, being human meant sharing the world with other kinds of humans, learning to compete with them, sometimes to cooperate with them, and occasionally to love and raise children with them. The idea of a single human species holding an entire planet to itself, with no rivals, no cousins, no alternative versions of what a human being could be, is a remarkably new and unusual state of affairs, one that has existed for only the last tiny fraction of our species' long history. Whatever combination of larger populations, wider social networks, greater cultural flexibility, and simple demographic momentum allowed Homo sapiens to become the last human species standing, that same combination of traits, our extraordinary capacity to connect, cooperate, and build shared culture across vast distances remains the foundation of everything we have built since. Cities, languages, science, art, entire civilizations, all of it rests on the same underlying ability that may have once given a numerically small, physically unremarkable species of African primate the edge it needed to outlast every other branch of the human family tree.
It is worth asking, in a world where those same connective threads between different groups of people sometimes feel more frayed and fragile than they have in generations, whether we are still holding on to the very thing that allowed our ancestors to survive when every other kind of human eventually did not. The story of these other human species did not end in some dramatic final battle, and it did not end in a single moment that anyone alive at the time could have recognized as an ending. It unfolded slowly over thousands of years in countless small encounters that no historian recorded and no memory preserved. Until one day, without any clear announcement, there was simply no one left of those other kinds carrying on their own separate lineage in isolation. What remained instead was something stranger and, in its own way, more remarkable. Fragments of those vanished species scattered invisibly across the genomes of the one human species that did survive, carried forward, generation after generation, into a present where their existence is known only because we learned, quite recently in the scope of this entire story, how to read the deep and patient record written into our own DNA.